Those of you who might have looked at today's programme in advance of this week will notice some changes to the running order, and Minister Naughton will be joining us later on this morning to offer her perspectives on today's theme. So in the meantime, we'll move directly to our first panel discussion of the day. This is going to consider the topic of parenting with a disability. So I'm very happy to welcome Gerard Brophy to chair this session, and I invite him and the panel speakers to come on stage here while I just say a little bit about Gerard. He is the Chief Social Worker in Tusla, the Child and Family Agency in Ireland. He has over 25 years' experience as a qualified social worker and manager working in child and family services across direct work and governance. Gerard supports practitioners in delivering effective services to children and families and promotes excellence and continuous improvement in practice. He is also leading for Tusla on the implementation of the Barnardos interagency model to support children who have experienced sexual abuse. So Gerard, I'll hand over to you to moderate this panel.
Thanks very much. So just as we're setting ourselves up here, again, it's a great honour, I have to say, to be here this morning with the National Disability Authority. We are joined online as well with one of our speakers today, Professor Eilionóir Flynn. And you can see Eilionóir online. And Eilionóir, we can see you here from the panel as well, thankfully. I'm just going to start with a few opening comments from the Tusla perspective, and then we're going to have an opportunity to hear from the very experienced panel we have, and I'll introduce them as we go through it just before people speak. So I just wanted to start today, I suppose, to reflect on the type of a discussion we're having here today. I was at a conference recently, or a presentation recently, in a completely different context, but there was a professor from Australia talking about, how do you actually implement really good services? What's the sort of constituent pieces you need for that? And she talked about a knowledge diamond. So a diamond in that it had 4 sides. So there were 4 constituent pieces to that. And, one of those sides is policy. The policy perspective, how you get good policy, how you develop that. Another one is practitioner wisdom. So just listening to people who've been in the field for years, knowing what it is, works and doesn't work. Another piece of it is research, really important piece we don't do enough of sometimes. We don't have enough data to understand it. But again, another side of that diamond. And the last one was that lived experience. And if one of those are missing, you don't really have the components to say how this is going to be implemented. And obviously the research needs to follow up at the end as well to see, actually, what's the outcome of all of this? And you need to continually be in that virtuous cycle. And I think today's panel reflects something of that. And hopefully is one of the ways in which we begin to integrate those different components and can affect real and meaningful change, in this case for people with disabilities. It'd be remiss of me not to say something about the role of Tusla in this as well, because Tusla, and we're associated a lot with social work and child protection, and in the disability area, I think there is still a lot of fear about Tusla intervention, Tusla being involved in a family. And I think universally, social workers are criticised for intervening too early, being overbearing, taking children into care too soon, or in cases not intervening in time and events happening. So in some ways, you can't win in that. But actually, what we're about really is about working with people and that universal design that Catherine referred to earlier. And this is definitely where we've tried to move our model in the last 10 to 15 years. And we've adopted a model of working that is called signs of safety, but we've adapted it for Ireland and our own use. And without going into that in too much detail, the basic principle behind that is engaging with the people, the families who we're working with, the parents, the children, the network around those parents to make safety for the child involved. So it's not about us coming in a paternalistic way to say you can or can't do this, but it is about us working with parents, working with families, working with networks in order to keep children safe. And I think in terms of where, as we go forward, for parents with a disability or who have children with a disability, it's really important that we engage with people on that level so that we're all partners in working together. The last 2 things I'd say is, one, the importance of the UN Convention, the Declaration of the Rights of People with a Disability, that it's a right-based service we provide. It's not a paternalistic one. And I think we've seen huge advances in that in Ireland in the last generation, and I hope we see more. But that people have a right, children have a right to be brought up in their own family, and they have a right to receive the supports to make that happen. And the last thing I'd say, practically speaking, assisted decision making. Again, it's a slightly different area, applies in different ways, but it is really, really important across that area of disability in terms of recognising ability. I think that's the most important principle behind it. And that should apply in all situations. Recognisability, supportability. And that's what we're certainly aiming to do. So that's just from the Tusla perspective. So it gives me great pleasure today to introduce our first speaker, who's Niamh Stack, who's developmental psychology and head of the Department of Psychology in Mary Immaculate University in Limerick. And Niamh has a particular interest in development, difference and diversity across the lifespan. And Niamh is going to speak to us for about 10 minutes. And then we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end. When all 4 speakers have spoken, we'll have an opportunity for questions. So you'll have, I think, an app that you can submit questions on or use the email. And then we'll also have an opportunity for people from the floor to ask questions as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to share the voices of the parents who participated within our survey. So just to give you a little bit of background to where the survey came from, the survey was jointly funded or triply funded by Tusla, HSC and ClareCare, with the aim to really think about what is it that people need, rather than what are we already providing for them that they may not need. So they would have sessions or support services in place and they weren't being used, and they were saying, why aren't these being used? So the reason that my colleagues Suzanne and Clara and I were interested within this study is that it was parent-led. So the study came out of a focus group with parents of lived experience. So they generated what the research should be about. And then we were brought on board as researchers, and we worked with parents with lived experience to generate the questionnaire, to design the questions, to think about how it should go out, who it should go out to. So it was really about that approach of doing research with parents, not on parents. And I can't tell you how valuable it was to have those parents with lived experience on our board. It really determined some of the design of the questionnaire and led us to insights that we wouldn't have gotten if we'd come at it with as researchers without the lived experience. So our thanks to both the participants who answered the survey, but very much so to the members of our research board who are parents with lived experience. So we are building on excellent research that's already out there from our colleagues in Barnardos and from our colleagues in Maynooth University, which tells us that parenting with a mental health challenge is not a minority experience. It's actually a higher incidence than probably most people would imagine. We also were interested in this idea of generational effects. So if you have a parent who's experiencing mental health challenges and they fail to get the support that they may need, the chances of you as a child developing mental health challenges are really quite high. So we need to intervene not just in terms of that individual, but to stop cycles of that and to stop generational issues. So that was kind of the impetus for why we were doing this research. I should say I'm going to fly through this because they've given me 10 minutes, and although I speak fast, there's little I can do in 10 minutes. But what I am going to do is pull out some key highlights. And at the end of it, you'll see that we have QR codes to the executive summary and to the final report where you can look at more detail. But just to say, in terms of respondents, we had 243 respondents from all provinces in the Republic of Ireland. And that is majorly in thanks to our excellent colleague, Clara, who must have emailed everybody in the country. So all schools around the country, all community groups, all GPs, all our colleagues in Tusla sent it out, all our colleagues in HSC. And you might say then, Niamh, why did you only get 243? That's actually high for an online survey of this kind, and we were really delighted with it. One of the things we were particularly delighted with was that there was 11% of fathers who participated. It's really, really hard to get fathers to participate, and it's really, really hard to get fathers with mental health challenges to participate. We had chosen, through discussions with our parents with lived experience, we wanted to do a national perspective on it, so we wanted it to be online because that would be an easier way for people to access it. We wanted it also to be online so that it could be anonymous, so people would feel free to provide their answers. We totally accept that that means it didn't reach everybody, because not everybody, in spite of our opinions that everybody's now online, not everybody has access to technology or has the reading ability to be able to access them in that particular way. So we appreciate there are limitations to the sample, but we were pleased with what we managed to get. Wanted to give you an example of why it was so important that we had parents with lived experience on our research board. One of the things that came up in the focus group before the survey and with our members on the research board was issues around medication. Now, we would not have thought to ask questions around that, and it's not in the research, but it came up, they said, put in questions about that. That's a big issue. And I wish I could give you the richness of the data that came out. It was a huge issue, particularly for females in terms of postnatal depression and taking medication. So within our participants, 38% said they were on medication currently or had taken, 26% had taken medication in the past. For those on medication, their role as a parent was never discussed as part of them being provided with a prescription for medication. And this was one of the key things that came out of the research, that disjoint of not thinking about the whole person. So a doctor is considering your mental health challenge, but not considering that of you as a parent, not considering that holistic thing. So one of the recommendations that came out was talking to medical professionals about making sure you're looking holistically at the person as a parent or a grandparent or a carer or where their situation is within the family, and to take those things in account. The importance of medication not impacting on parenting came across strongly. People were anxious about taking medication in case it would impede their parenting. So if you have a very young baby, you want to be awake if they wake in the night. So taking sleeping pills may not be one of your options, but people not having nuanced conversations around that. And then in contrast, there was conversations about, well, I do want to take the medication. I feel very strongly about taking the medication because if I'm better mum, then my child will have better parenting experience. We asked them, was there particular issues around parenting in itself is hard. It's a big challenge across the lifespan, but parenting with a mental health challenge, does that have specific issues? I felt so bad because I thought I should parent, I should be the stable person, the person with the answers, the person who could control their emotions. I'll never forget the look on my daughter's face the day I broke down. So when we talk about mental health issues being more open and transparent now, and people being more understanding about them, parents don't feel that way because they question whether or not their competency will be called into question because they're parenting with a mental health challenge. So their ability to be open feels a bit more restricted. Do parents who are experiencing mental health challenges require specific support? And the answer to this is there is no one answer. It depends on who you are, what kind of support you need. There needs to be greater consideration, clearly, about the impact of parenting by healthcare professionals. GP services need to take parents going through a crisis seriously, particularly women. They said, you know, they got a lot of feedback, oh, it's just the baby blues and all of those kind of things when they were in real crisis. So making sure that they're heard. In terms of the fathers that participate in the study, they were saying, I don't want to be in big groups, I'd like to be in a small group with peers. Some parents said to us, yes, I would love to be in a peer support group, but I can't get there because I can't afford the bus fare for it, or I've nobody to mind my child while I'm getting there. So we need to think about when we're providing support services that we're providing a range of different support services, because not one solution fits all. What were the kind of barriers to seeking help? Money and fear of judgment were the two highest reported barriers in seeking support, followed closely by stigma, work commitments, and childcare. All the things that we would think, yes, that would be an understandable barrier. But how do we begin to break down those barriers? This links to open comments in other parts of the survey about the value of therapy and counselling, but the prohibitive costs around this. Would it help talking to other parents within similar situations? And again, the answer isn't a simple yes or no in relation to this. The answer is it depends. For some people, it felt amazing to be part of a peer group because they felt like, I'm not alone, I'm not the only one struggling, I have other people who know what it feels like. For others, they actually found it more overwhelming. To listen to more people's challenges while they were struggling themselves made them feel completely overwhelmed. Or they felt like, you're not really struggling, I'm struggling more. So it felt like a really challenging situation to be put in and to be told that this was helpful. So again, it's about talking to people, not assuming what they want, but asking them what they want. Do your children know about your experience of mental health challenges? And there was real diversity within this. For some parents, they did not want their children to know because they didn't want their children to feel they couldn't come to them because they were worried about their parents' mental health and worried about upsetting them. For other parents, they felt it was really important to be open, to be transparent, and therefore their children would feel okay about talking about these issues too. And there's no right position in any of this. It's about talking to the family and supporting them in how they want to progress it. One of the things that came across most strongly in the survey was the feeling of isolation, the feeling of not being listened to. For many, many parents, they were saying, thank you for asking me. Thank you for making sure that my perspective is valid and legitimate and that I have something to say. When we were putting out this survey, we were worried about getting any respondents. I had very low expectations because online surveys tend to get low responses. But I cannot emphasize enough to you the richness of data, the long textual answers that we received, because people were so happy that somebody was finally giving them the chance to talk. I heard about this on the radio. It's an excellent idea. Well done on doing this survey. It's added another step to normalizing my struggle. Sharing really helps. I feel we should be able to talk openly about our experiences of parents with mental health issues, without fear of judgment or lack of interest if from others is still holding us back. So that sense of listening to people, of giving them voice, of thinking about the whole person when we're trying to support them is really, really important. I'd like to give a final word to one of the parents. I would like to say the biggest issue for me has been trying to keep my head above water while feeling like I'm drowning, and then trying so hard to get the supports for myself to ensure I could be the best version of myself as a parent also. It's really challenging to be a parent, and it's exceptionally challenging if you're then struggling and feel you can't ask for support because of the types of struggles that you're having. As I say, that's a whistle-stop tour through what is really rich data, and I would invite you to check out the executive summary, which is for those who like a short read, and then the longer full summary which has more details in it. And happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Niamh. Well, just to congratulate Niamh now on finishing in great time. She finished spot on 10 minutes. Having said that now, I'd ask our next participants maybe to slow down a little bit. I know Niamh is trying to get through a lot of information. It'll help our captioners just to catch it that little bit more accurately.
Apologies, I'm a Clare woman. We find it very hard to speak slowly.
And just to say, I think there's two very important aspects to what Niamh has presented there. One is it's parents-led on deciding what the research is going to be. That's really, really important. And I want to call out Clare Care particularly in this, and Niamh mentioned them earlier. Small enough organisation involved in Clare, but who have pioneered that sort of parent-led research. They had done a piece with us previously as well about parents of children in care. And so important of parents involved in that. Adults who have experience, able to voice their concerns and able to contribute significantly to making that research better. Really, really important. Really good use of lived experience. So we're going to move on. And I'm going to introduce, I'm delighted to introduce Louise Milicevic. And I'm hoping I get that second name right, Louise, but you can correct me later.
Close enough.
Yeah. So Louise is Learning and Development Administrator with the Rehab Group and a volunteer peer advocate and member of Disabled Women of Ireland. Now, Louise is a disabled woman with lived experience of disabled parenting. A mother of 3, Louise is a self-advocate through her own journey and has highlighted the barriers experienced by disabled parents. Over the years, Louise has contributed to research relating to disabled parenting, including the Real Productive Justice Project, and has addressed the Oireachtas on issues relating to productive justice in the context of Assisted Human Reproductive Act. Louise has worked for over 20 years as well for the Rehab Group in a corporate function capacity and is a member, as I said, of Disabled Women Ireland, a national representative organisation of disabled women, girls and non-binary people in Ireland. Delighted to introduce Louise, and Louise, your 10 minutes starts now.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. My name is Louise Milicevic. I'm delighted to be here this morning to share my experience of being a disabled parent. I have 3 daughters, 17, 14 and 6. So it's a busy household, as you can imagine. And first and foremost, I'm a parent with the same trials, tribulations, joys, hopes, fears as any parent raising teenage daughters and young children. However, as a disabled parent, there are some additional barriers that one faces, and I'm going to touch on a couple of these this morning. Although it's not my experience, women with disabilities experience one of the highest rates of poverty and social isolation of all people in Ireland, even more so than disabled men. This, of course, exacerbates barriers and exacerbates each barrier and limits our opportunities to create the supportive and accessible parenting experience of our choice. Like other women, disabled women are most likely to experience or be subjected to domestic or partner abuse when pregnant. However, unlike other women, disabled women are at 3 to 5 times increased risk, and most refuges and support services and are inaccessible to them. Poverty and the increased financial dependency brought about by any pregnancy can make it impossible for women to escape, as was highlighted in the research which was done by DWI and Women's Aid last year. And this report is available on the DWI website for people who would like to know more. The biggest barrier I have faced during my parenting journey has been attitudinal. And this is fundamentally linked to the fact that society does not perceive disabled people as potential or expectant parents, and are therefore flummoxed when we present as such. I became pregnant with my first child in 2007, and I presumed that there would be a wide range of supports available to me. And I discovered very quickly that myself and my husband, who was also disabled, were on our own. I discovered the OTs, occupational therapists, public health nurses, etc., were astounded and could offer no support on adaptive equipment or alternative care techniques for lifting, changing, feeding, etc. The automatic assumption was that my husband and I would be unable to care for our child independently or competently, and that we would need to source full-time care for her. At that time, which we eventually gave in and just agreed to that. And I might also mention that this was something which we had to fund ourselves. There was no funding available. So you can imagine how expensive full-time care for an infant was for 2 people. Article 23.2 of the UNCRPD states that the state party shall render appropriate assistance to people with disabilities in performance of their child-rearing responsibilities. However, in my experience and the anecdotal evidence from other disabled parents, seems to suggest that the support is not policy-driven and is dependent on individuals or entities' willingness to provide that assistance. Current service provision models do not include provisions for offering tailored support for disabled parents based on individual needs, but where this takes place, it is highly beneficial. For example, my consultant organised personalised antenatal classes with a physiotherapist in the hospital to help us, myself and my husband, find one-handed lifting techniques for lifting, dressing and caring for our baby. She was the first real person who offered real, tangible, practical support, and the fact that she kept an open mind, listened to us without judgment, and accepted that we were the experts in our own lives paid enormous dividends. Meanwhile, my local occupational therapist couldn't provide guidance on adaptive baby lifting equipment and could only suggest medical devices related to my mobility, which weren't needed. The techniques that we used and honed in over the intervening years for lifting, changing, etc., looked unconventional, and at times those who observed them were very uncomfortable with them. So we spent a lot of the girls' babyhood assuring people that we knew what we were doing. Furthermore, we were always aware of our own limitations. So if there was anything we were unsure of or uncomfortable doing ourselves, we always sought help. But at times, the fact that our own cognizance of this was not always taken into consideration. And at times, we were made to feel that we were endangering the life of our child or children when in fact we weren't. Our experience when having my first child actually dissuaded us from looking for help for the birth of our subsequent 2 children. I found myself being very economical with the truth when asked about did we have various supports at home. And we've essentially have raised our daughters ourselves with occasional support from family and friends. This is not an uncommon experience for disabled parents to be met with distrust and suspicion and have their rights to parent called into question if they reach out for help. And many have learned to avoid the notice of healthcare workers and state bodies meant to support them for risk of maybe losing their children. Disabled Women Ireland explain how systemic prejudice and biases in the parental capacity assessments undermine disabled parents' human rights in recent submissions to the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the CRPD committees earlier this year. And I urge anyone working in this area or is interested in equality to read these submissions again on the DWI website. Of course, parenting is not just about babyhood, and providing and understanding reasonable accommodation is key to successful parenting. I'm just going to touch on two areas in relation to this. One is education and the other is healthcare. At the moment, there is no coherent policy across the education system, with schools adopting an ad hoc approach to reasonable accommodation. For example, our local primary school, where my older 2 girls attended, were very supportive. They used to reserve parking space on big event days. They would, and on parent-teacher meetings, they would move. They allowed the parent-teacher meeting to take place in an office adjacent to the front door rather than in the classroom, which eliminated the need for long walks. Whereas I found their post-primary to be a little less accommodating with these things, such as online parent-teacher conferences. They've reverted back to the face-to-face. And anyone here today who's the parent of teenage children will understand how onerous these secondary school parent-teacher meetings can be with maybe 10 or 12 teachers to be seen. So imagine navigating that with a mobility impairment. Similarly, the one-parent guardian policy in hospitals introduced during the pandemic indirectly discriminated against parents with disabilities who needed to bring a support person with them. I was effectively removed from my youngest child's healthcare needs during her early years, as I was told I could not bring a support person with me when she'd attend hospital. Nor were they willing to allow me to attend virtually either. Although this policy is now rescinded, we need to learn from this so that it does not happen again. I'm now aware that a HSE policy existed at the time, allowing a support person to accompany people with parents with disabilities, but this was not my experience, nor was it communicated in any correspondence that I had with the hospitals. Going forward, we need to ensure that all policies and procedures are suitably disability-proofed and do not discriminate against parents with disabilities. Moreover, this needs to be communicated to all staff and the general public so that everyone is aware of the procedure. My final point this morning is the need for formal peer support for disabled parents. One of the most positive outcomes of my pregnancy was meeting other disabled parents who offered advice, encouragement, and I think outside the box approach to parenting. Over the years, I in turn have offered support to new parents, and the learning from each other is immeasurable. The introduction of a funded, formal peer support network would be invaluable to both disabled people and professionals alike. We need to look at national and international best practice in this regard. For example, Enable to Parent in the UK, or indeed the peer support counselling service run by the Irish Kidney Association in our own country, as a first step in making it a reality. It is concerning that 18 years after discovering I was pregnant with my first child, searches for disabled parent supports still primarily yield information relevant to parents of disabled children. This significant gap highlights the ongoing need for dedicated resources and supports for disabled parents in Ireland. We can learn much from international organisations, so we need to start engaging with them. In summary, parents with disabilities, like all other parents, prioritise the well-being of their children above all else. A collaborative, open-minded approach which recognises people with disabilities as experts in their own lives will give parents with disabilities the tools and confidence to parent effectively. Ultimately, parents with disabilities need to be part of the conversation, and our experiences, both positive and negative, be the catalyst for change. Thank you.
Louise, thanks very much. Now, you did go slightly over time. I think if anyone could go over time with this panel, it's you. I really liked your economical with truth piece. So, I mean, isn't it terrible that has to be the way, you know, and that's your experience, and you've described that really, really well. But I think, again, your proposal about that funded peer support, really, really important, and we can learn from other organisations. So we're now going to move to Professor Eilionóir Flynn, and if I can check with our captioning colleagues if that's working any better, if we're slowing down a little bit, and just encourage Eilionóir and Niamh again to slow it down a little bit, that again we give a chance, because I know how frustrating it is if you're dependent on text and it doesn't follow, that that you can't catch up. So Eilionóir is an established chair in law and director of the Centre for Disability Law and Policy at the University of Galway. Her research focuses on disability and social justice, with particular emphasis on legal capacity, access to justice, and the intersection of disability, gender and ageing. Her first book, From Rhetoric to Action, Implementing the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2011. And then, since then, she's gone on to publish extensively in the domain of disability rights. Now, Eilionóir is also involved in providing support to the Secretariat and the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and in particular the working group which developed General Comment 1. And again, I think the people that are talking here this morning have a really significant background, and we're benefiting, I think, from that as we go. So, Eilionóir, it's all yours for 10 minutes now, Eilionóir.
Thank you very much, Gerard. It's great to be joining you virtually today. And just to complement the speakers who went before me as well on giving really valuable insights. I was privileged to work with Louise a bit on the project that I'm going to talk about now, and I really want to echo everything that you've said, Louise, particularly around peer support. So I'm going to share with you some insights from the Real Productive Justice Project, which was funded by Welcome, which ran from 2019 to 2023. So we were still trying to collect oral histories from disabled people in the midst of the pandemic, and you can imagine how challenging that was, particularly when we had to move from having lovely chats in people's kitchens where we held their babies and chatted to them over tea to trying to get people to talk to us online. But in the end, we did manage to collect 31 oral histories of disabled people. We were looking at their experiences not only of parenting, but right through the reproductive journey. So we asked about fertility and contraception, abortion access, pregnancy and birth, as well as parenting. We also interviewed 27 key informants across the professions from health, social care and legal practitioners, including judges, to understand how people came in contact with disabled people and how they worked with them. And at the end of the project, as well as our report, we've provided some toolkits on each of the topics, and also a communication toolkit in general for practitioners in engaging with disabled people about reproductive decision making, and a Know Your Rights guide for disabled people themselves. So I'm going to just highlight some key overarching themes that came across in the experiences of parenting from both disabled people themselves and also from the professionals that we spoke with. The barriers are quite similar to what has already been described by the previous speakers. So ableism was a clear barrier, but also internalized ableism of the disabled parents themselves. Inaccessible environments, particularly where people were being observed in terms of their parenting or going to get parenting support, was an issue as well. Overall, many people described how they felt particularly that there were higher standards imposed on disabled parents than on non-disabled parents in terms of the capabilities and strengths that we expect parents to be able to demonstrate and how we check or monitor whether parents are achieving those goals. And a huge labour of access that disabled parents were asked to do in order to make things accessible. Disabled people were taking on the burden of making things accessible themselves when systems that they were interacting with were not trying to adapt or change to try to accommodate them. On the positive side, the enablers that people reported to us are very much around peer support, as Louise has already said, but also a type of access intimacy. And this is a term that was developed by Mia Mingus, who's a disabled activist and scholar, who talks about that relief when people just get your access needs and are able to provide for you what you need in that moment. We also found an enabler where professionals in particular recognised disabled people's agency and were willing to collaborate, defer to the disabled person's expertise and knowledge of their own body-mind, and work together to develop creative solutions. So I'm going to begin by giving you some examples of those barriers I've just described, and then I'll talk through some examples of enablers before I conclude. So one man we spoke to, Dave, who had a physical disability and who was a foster parent in a queer relationship, talked about the questions that he was asked when applying to foster with his partner. And because of his disability, he was asked a lot about his mobility. So, you know, what would happen if the foster child ran out in front of a car? Like, would he be able to stop them? Would he be able to play football? What if the child wants to play football? And Dave had replied that, you know, he, regardless of his legs, he really wasn't interested in football, but was interested in lots of other things and had a very creative background in the media and was, you know, also interested in other sports, but just not football. So again, a lot of the questions and I suppose experience of that process that Dave went through very much felt like Dave was getting the message that you wouldn't be able for it, you would be too weak, too sick, too incapacitated. This was the kind of messaging that he felt very clearly emanated from that process. And while they did go on to foster several children very successfully, he always felt that extra layer of scrutiny on his foster parent ability because of both his disability and his sexual identity. Internalized ableism came across very clearly for some parents, particularly the parents with intellectual disabilities that we spoke with. So one parent talked about, as a woman with intellectual disability who was living in a residential service, when she became pregnant, she herself thought that she needed to inform Tusla. And so we were really curious as researchers about why she thought this. So, you know, we asked, like, well, who taught you need to tell Tusla? Was it the service provider? And she said, no, not really. She just, you know, she knew, she felt herself that was something that we needed to do. And then the social worker and the service provider also kind of supported that kind of decision. But again, a very strange thing, because that's not something that non-disabled parents would ever think of doing, to inform Tusla of their pregnancy. And then we also heard from staff working in disability services who were very concerned about preemptive referrals to Tusla. So one social worker that we spoke with was very upset that a staff member she supervised was talking about making a preliminary reference to Tusla for a woman who was pregnant because she was asking for supports in attending the hospital. Because she was a disabled parent who was talking about, you know, I'm not sure I'm understanding what they're telling me in appointments. I'm not sure if I'm taking it in. Like, she was acting really appropriately and she was asking for support, and then, you know, potentially experiencing backlash for looking for support, that was being used to call into question her potential parenting ability. So she was very concerned about that. The inaccessible environments that people experienced were obviously, there were a lot of physical barriers, particularly for people with mobility impairments, but there were other kinds of inaccessible environments that participants described to us as well. So Lexi, who was neurodivergent, talked about how she hated going into hospital because of the bright lights, because, you know, it was so noisy, people are all close sitting beside you. And so any time that she needed to go in with her child or during her pregnancy, that she felt like this environment is taking a really severe toll on her because of her neurodivergence. Another mother with a physical disability described to us how before she was allowed to leave hospital after the birth of her child, she had to dress her, undress her, change her nappy and dress her in front of 2 physios, an OT, the senior nurse on the ward and somebody else. Now again, you know, she pointed out very rightly, what able-bodied mother would be able to do that who hadn't had experience of it? So she found that really challenging and a real, you know, indictment on her parenting ability, the need to prove more than a non-disabled parent would how capable she was. I want to just briefly touch on parental capacity assessments, because this is something that came up a lot. One of the parents we spoke with who was neurodivergent talked about how the parental capacity was being done on her in another environment that wasn't her natural environment, and how difficult that was, and how many of the other parents that were undergoing this kind of assessment were parents who maybe had different issues to her, had experiences of addiction. They may not have wanted the baby, but she had really planned and deliberately become a parent by choice as a single parent, and then to be brought out of her natural environment and have to experience that very what she felt was a very punishing parental capacity assessment really damaged her confidence in how she would be able to parent. Again, the labour of access that disabled people have to do to find out everything themselves as parents. One parent with a physical disability described to us how long it took her to research what kind of buggy would be suitable for her, what kind of car seat would work for her, and not having any support from the services that are generally available in order to do that with her, or to try to source some of that information for her. But on the positive side, people did describe some really good examples of peer support. And that parent that I've just talked about, who needed ages to research the buggy and the car seat, said that at the time when she was pregnant, she didn't know any other parents that had the same disability as her. And now that she is parenting, she does know 3 or 4 other mothers, and how important that has been to her to be able to share that experience and information with people who really understand. Similarly, a deaf parent that we spoke to talked about how she, the other parents, the other mothers in her child's school had gotten together. They were doing a kind of a social support event, and she had said, despite being invited, oh, you know, I can't because I really need an interpreter and I just wouldn't be comfortable. And that the other mother said, don't worry, we'll organise an interpreter. And it was a social meeting in the pub, and that the interpreter was there, and everything really worked. So that access intimacy of other parents who weren't themselves deaf or disabled, and who had just responded really naturally to ensure that she could be included in that, and how important that was for her. Finally, then, my last point on recognising agency and creative solutions. One of the parents who spoke to us talked about how much she appreciated professionals saying, look, I don't know, I've never dealt with a person like you before with your disability, but let's work together, let's come up with some solutions. So by the time, oh, that's my timer, so I should stop. By the time you're ready to have this baby, you'll have some techniques and tools that you can use. Just on that final point again, one of the parents talked about how she would do things in an unusual way because of her disability. So she might remove her child's clothes using her teeth or her feet, or doing different things that she wouldn't feel comfortable necessarily doing in front of professionals. But once she got home and in her own environment with people around her who understood her access needs, she felt much more confident doing those things there. So I think I need to stop, but that was just a whistle-stop tour of some of the things the parents told us about. I'm very happy to share links to our research as well with anyone who would like to see the detail behind the research and the toolkits with some practical tips and suggestions for professionals who are engaging with disabled parents.
Brilliant. Thanks, Eilionóir. And it's like as if you were in the room, I have to say, just watching you online. It's really, really good. We're just going to move straight on to our last speaker then. So our last speaker here is Niamh McCarthy. And Niamh is Head of Services for the Parents Advocacy and Information Service with Barnardos. So this is a pilot project. It's an information and advice strand that's available nationwide. Face-to-face advocacy is available in Dublin North City, Waterford and Wexford, and it's about advocates working with parents to help them navigate child protection proceedings, including court, and work with parents and key stakeholders to ensure parents and participants have a voice in childcare proceedings. And again, we'll take some questions after this. We have some really good questions coming in online, so if you have questions on the floor as well, we'll take a question from the floor first when Niamh is finished. So again, just if you have that ready. So Niamh.
Perfect, thanks Gerard. Again, as all the panellists have said, I'm delighted to be here today. I have a bit of imposter syndrome following on from the ladies, but I'll give it the best shot. And I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about is crossing over a bit in the previous talks as well. So this is a pilot program, and it is really about supporting parents whose children are already in care or are on the cusp of coming into care. So navigating really difficult meetings, court appointments, events, and different really difficult systems for all parents in this situation who are really vulnerable as well. And I suppose as it is a pilot, we've started to evaluate our service. So one of the key issues we were looking at was the intersectionality of the complex issues that families and parents present to our services with. And I suppose 30% of our parents at the time of referral outlined that they had a disability, be it from an intellectual disability, physical, or learning disability. And I suppose I just want to go on to a point about a previous speaker. That was at the time of referral. As we go on the journey with the parents and establish trusting relationships, they are more comfortable to disclose further. So I believe that 30% number is much higher in actual reality. And I suppose our service is all about collaboration, empowerment and participation, and working with partners such as Tusla and the parents to try and get the best decision making and solutions for the family, their family. And I suppose it's very key to stress, even when a child is not living in the household, they are still the parents of that child and still have such a key role in their child's upbringing and their family and decision making. So it's really our role to create those conditions based on what the parent is telling us, so that they can participate fully in all these proceedings, which are really difficult, I have to say. And I suppose one of the things that we do is court accompanied, for example, which is a really busy, really noisy area. Solicitors are running up, giving you a 5-minute brief before you run in to hear about a very difficult case and some very difficult evidence probably in relation to your child. There's a lot of stigma, a lot of shame. In many cases, people may avoid court because it may not be accessible. They may not have the resources they need to participate fully. They may not understand the language. So it's our role to come alongside them and to really advocate for that. For example, if somebody is suffering with social anxiety, a lot, that we would try and facilitate that they could participate online. Then we come back to our attitudinal piece where people would say, oh no, the judge likes to see a parent in front of them. The judge, that's really important. It means they really want to be involved in their child's life. Whereas, it's up to us then to advocate for that parent. This parent does want to really involved. This is how they can be involved, and it's really important to facilitate that. So breaking down those barriers in terms of attitude, and even from barristers and solicitors and things like that. Oh, I don't know if we'd like an advocate. There'll be an automatic assumption there's a capacity issue here. No, it's better we don't have you. So we really need to focus on the best interest of the children as well. And the best interest of the children is bringing in the strengths of their family and their parents into the proceedings and helping them to negotiate that. We look at very different environments where, and our last speaker talked about environments a lot, where you're not in your natural environment. You're attending meetings in buildings that can be really busy. There's a lot of people. A child in care conference, for example, there may be guards, there may be GPs, there may be social workers, team leaders, principals. There's so many people. And I suppose chairs of conferences are really good in bringing parents in line, but it's really our job to try and ensure that that environment is conducive to the parents' full participation. So be that coming half an hour earlier, getting to meet everybody on an individual basis, knowing when to take breaks, all of those, what may seem like very easy things for us to do, but it's not. Like, if you're a parent in this situation where your child is possibly going into care or is already in care, you feel very judged, you don't want to ask questions, you don't want to put up your hand and say, I need a break, I don't understand what's happening. So really that's the role of the advocacy service, to come alongside and to ensure. as before mentioned as well, the pandemic has come into our conversations a few times today, and we really see that in the childcare system still very alive today in terms of some of the practices that came in, such as teleconferencing and things like that, still happen today, and that may be really to benefit that as many professionals can attend or many people in the child's life can attend, but isn't always the best for the parent. And particularly if parents have significant issues, such as in one case a parent was deaf and couldn't participate in teleconferences, but there was no option at that time. So that's the role then again of the advocate to come alongside, make sure that it's the proper supports. And in this case, in particular, looking at Shine and other agencies that can come alongside the parent to attend meetings in person as well. I suppose breaking down any barriers such as the in-camera rule to make sure that those supports and helping people to understand what all these legal terms are, what they mean, but that doesn't mean that somebody isn't entitled to correct supports to make sure that they can participate fully within their child's life. One of the things I just wanted to mention as well, parental capacity assessments. So for some parents, in my experience over the last few years, this is the first time they may hear that they have a disability or that they have a diagnosis, and it's very overwhelming to be part of a parental capacity assessment as it is, but it's also like to be hearing such news for the first time is really difficult, and then obviously that gives a different focus on their reflection of their parenting journey to date and what supports can be put in place. One of our key roles is assisting in those parental capacity assessments and making sure we do advocate for the right environments, that the parent is giving the full opportunity to participate as fully as possible as well. Wanted to tell you a little case story of a really good news story. Again, a parent with a significant intellectual disability was going through care proceedings during the pandemic. Very difficult, was too afraid to ask questions, so really consented to everything as we went along, was very compliant. And you know, there was significant capacity issues, so therefore there needed to be a lot of supports put in place. But on review of the full care order, their access and their family contact has been going so well. There was new supports identified, a new plan was looked at for that parent, and reunification has now happened with the scaffolding and the support that was in the community. So that for me is a real message of hope that, you know, that if we really listen to what parents are telling us and really look at, you know, it's not big changes, but tweaking things to make them accessible and not assuming that everything, we create equity for people to really participate fully. I'm currently working with a group of parents in Dublin, in the Leinster area, and we're developing a resource for parents of children in care. And the amount of knowledge that they have given me in developing this resource, from the viewpoint of what colours to use, like really simple, really mindful things, but also from their perspective living with various different disabilities such as ADHD, dyslexia and all those, but they are so mindful and have such a wealth of experience to make it the best resource for everybody possible. And I have to say, every day for me is just such a pleasure to come alongside and to be able to co-create in this way as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Louise. So we've extended this session a little bit just to, again, add on 10 minutes to take some questions, because we've probably spoken a little bit longer than we should. We have some really good questions here. Again, if anyone has a question in the audience, we have a roving mic and it'll get to you. Someone put in a question, and we have two questions. So someone put in a question very early on about why the government, there's such a barrier to get disability allowance from the government. We mightn't be the right panel to answer that question, but it might be a really important question for somebody else to comment on at a later stage. But we might take some of these questions first, and if one of our panel want to comment on that, we could. But we'll just take this question here first.
Hi, Fiona Branachas Anam and recovery experts by experience. I suppose I just wanted to comment, Niamh, about the research. I wanted to ask you, I suppose, was there anybody, any parent, any mother, particularly any parent who contributed who rejects psychiatric diagnosis? Because under the CRPD, people have a right to mental and physical integrity, and to define their experience and what supports they would require to exercise their right to legal capacity. Mm-hmm. We have many of us damaged by psychiatric diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And the ramifications in terms of discrimination, in terms of workplace, in terms of communities, in terms of accessing healthcare on an equal basis. And also it links into Tusla and the loss of children due to psychiatric diagnosis. It plays quite a significant factor. The mandate of the CRPD, we're supposed to be moving to a social human rights model of disability away from the medical model. The reality is the state is not upholding that. And even the Mental Health Bill 2024 is a typical example. It contains a very significant regression of rights, and it's been railroaded through the Oireachtas at this moment. So I think in terms of, and when you say with, Niamh, you're imputing that with mental health challenges. I absolutely reject that. Some people will identify with that, many others won't. That's precisely what caused the discrimination and the human rights violations that I and many others experience. And the CRPD prohibits that. Do you know what I mean? We have a right to mental and physical integrity, and also under Article 25, the right to give informed consent. And many of these medications, when you actually drill into the research, people like Joanna Moncrief, a psychiatrist and researcher in the UK, there's very little difference between placebo and the actual drug. And people are not given the information to give informed consent. John Reid also, in relation to electroshock, we're particularly fond of electroshocking women and young people, women, girls, and personality disorder if they're repeatedly presenting with suicidal attempts, self-harm. We love to give women, particularly, and girls, and young people, increasingly these labels. So, I think the National Disability Authority, in terms of research, we haven't seen anything from you, anything that's remotely or even been asked what research we would like.
I think the point is well made. Really, really interesting point. Has that come up into research at all? I think that's the question. And again, really well made points, really valid points. Yeah.
Two things that came up, and I totally accept the validity of the points that you're making. And yes, I think that's food for thought for us as researchers and how we go about it. And I think we've learned through doing this study and the feedback we've gotten from parents and from presenting at different conferences about this, about how we would change what we would do. But 2 points I would mention in relation to it. One of the things that came up with the parents that were working on the board was that they were very clear that they didn't want you to have a formal diagnosis to participate in the research. So you were invited to participate in the research whether or not you had a formal diagnosis or whether or not you wanted a formal diagnosis. You were asked to participate, or you were invited to participate. And then the other thing was, again, to return to that point about parents on the focus group emphasising the need to talk about medication. And that then led to a richness of data about why people might not want to engage in medication and their right not to engage in medication, and the need to think about medication not being a quick and simple answer to things. Medication works for some people, and I'm not taking a stance here on medication. I'm just saying there are many reasons why people may or may not want to take it and may or may not feel it's appropriate in their life, and we need to make sure that we're not just saying, oh, you're in this box, that's what the solution is for you. That's the biggest thing to come across in this research, that there isn't a very quick, that we need to, and this is the hardest thing, we need to take the time. We need to take the time to figure out what's good for that person and how we can best support them.
And just did the CRPD feature in your research at all? Like, did that come into it? Because that's what we need to see, is embedding the convention across, and it's at each and every stage
It's
how
a good
you
question.
plan.
No, just about the CRPD, does that come into the research? Question?
No, it didn't come in as a question. It underpinned kind of why we were doing it, but it didn't come in as a question, and it wasn't raised by participants. But I very much take on board that point for
and
further
just
research.
to define it in terms of rights.
Yeah.
Just conscious that's
the
a
state's legal obligations in terms of rights and obligations, because that's not featuring.
That's a conversation that we could continue on after this as well when we're having coffee. Just to give a bit of space actually for more questions. So we have another question here.
Hi, how's it going? Billy here. How long have you been in the NDA, guys?
How long have we been in the NDA?
Yes, is that okay?
Yeah, I'm not a member of the NDA now. I don't work for the NDA. I work for Tusla, and we're all working in different organisations.
And how long has this been going on for? How many years?
I'm sorry, I don't understand that question.
How many years has it been going on for?
The NDA?
Yes, okay.
25 years?
Cool. That's all I have.
Thank you. Good question. Any other questions from the floor? We have a question over here. The orange jumper.
Hi, my name is Brendan O'Reilly. We're based in Proserpingo. I remember a story someone told me that she was going through something. Excuse me for talking. You hear my voice is a bit low. I get nervous sometimes.
That's okay.
Yeah, she was saying that she was badly treated when she was younger, and they told her that she needed to take medication. And then she assumed that coming off the medication would help her. And then when she walked in and said to the doctor that I want to come on off the medication, they said, well, you can go now. So I think some doctors are still pushing people to take medication even though they don't want to take the medication. I don't know if that's still going on now, but...
Do you want me to say that?
Yeah, do please. Niamh.
So what came across very much, there's a series of recommendations within the documentation that I gave you, and one thing that came across was training for medical health professionals, but also parenting support professionals, etc., around discussions of not assuming what is good for somebody, but actually letting them tell you what they're expert in their lives about what's good for them. And medication is incredibly complex because coming off it immediately can have its own repercussions. Some other work that I do is also with the project in Limerick called Bedford Row, who supports families who have somebody who's in prison, and that's a really complex situation because there's more women are more readily incarcerated, but yet they'll have mental health issues, and then also in relation to being trauma informed in prison services around that, because they're parenting as well in those contexts. So the need for trauma informed approaches, the need for holistic approaches, and the need for time, which seems to be what all of us are short of in terms of whether we're counsellors or doctors or nurses or teachers, that we just need to have time to sit with people.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Niamh. We're taking one last question from the floor here, and then we're going to take the online questions. Now.
This is more an observation than a question.
Great.
We know within disability there's silos. You're part of this group, that group, the other group. The overlap of these silos is a no man's land. But one of the silos I think we should always kind of keep in mind is the non-disabled partner, the non-disabled parent that is part of the parenting of the children of a disabled parent. Quite often that partner does carry, and I'm going to use the awful term burden, and I don't mean that the disabled partner is a burden, it's the social implication, the social barriers. Because it's not only the disabled parent that is excluded and left outside the door often, the non-disabled partner may also be ignored and excluded as well.
And again, that's a comment for inclusivity, isn't it? And just considering everybody's needs in that. And I think if we adopt a universal approach to this, then we can overcome that. But if we don't adopt a universal approach, if we don't include everybody, then you don't overcome that. So some really good questions online. I mentioned the first one earlier, which might be better answered in another part of the day today. But there's a question here. The Childcare Law Project shows that 28% of care proceedings related to parents with disabilities. Again, a really important finding from that. What measure can be taken to support disabled parents who are engaged in care proceedings? And Niamh referred to some of that, but I might just take that myself from the Tusla perspective. And it was something actually that Eilionóir referred to earlier as well, in terms of people thinking they have to report to Tusla, or somebody being told maybe to go to Tusla because they wanted supports, because they just didn't understand what they were being asked, or they wanted supports to help them understand it better or react to it. Well, that's a fairly typical situation we see, and I think again it's because we don't have universal provision or good universal understanding or a universal approach. So what we should see, and this has been well established in the Irish courts, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, where we've been to courts with the HSE and Tusla, and the courts establish you cannot take a child into care simply because they don't get the supports. And if the supports aren't offered, that is the HSE's responsibility. So we do have a division of powers. So Tusla doesn't have a legal responsibility to provide universal services for everybody, including those with a disability. But the HSE has that legal responsibility and obligation. But I think, again, somebody referred to it earlier, if we have better integrated services, so if Tusla doesn't walk away from those cases but stays involved, has the conversation, continue to understand what the parents' needs are or the child's needs are, and advocate with the HSE for the provision of those services, we can, I think, reduce that number from 28%. But that is a significant challenge. There is a lot of support needed, and Louise gave evidence to that earlier in terms of, the assumption there might be services there, but in fact there isn't. Everybody ends up having to look for them themselves, fight for them themselves in some cases. And again, we saw maybe some of the solutions that might be that peer advocacy piece, which needs to be funded, which needs to be supported. Another question here, really good question. How can we ensure that disabled fathers are more visible in discussions about parenting and disability? Anyone care to take an answer to that?
Well, again, I think if there was a formal funded peer support network, that all disabled parents, both male and female and non-binary, etc., could be involved.
Yeah.
I think that would be the first step, because, I mean, as I said earlier, my husband is disabled, so he's a disabled father, so he's had different challenges that I wouldn't have had, but. I think it's important to have their voice as well as disabled mothers.
Yeah, and Niamh?
I just add to that, coming through from the fathers that participated in our study, we think we've done an awful lot of work around the stigma of mental illness, but really we're more accepting of some mental illness than other mental illness. And then when it comes to parenting, we still have challenges around that. And what the parents, whichever role they were playing, said in our survey was, we need to talk about it. We need to be okay that it's okay, and not it's okay to not be okay, but it's okay. There are other parents out there with mental health challenges, and it doesn't mean your child's going to be taken away from you. We need to be more transparent about what will actually happen and what the supports are, and to hear more from people with this lived experience.
Yeah, brilliant.
I think it is that inclusion from the beginning as well for all fathers, and then especially for fathers with disability or mental health issues, that it's an attitudinal piece as well at the very start of the journey. So it's up to us as a society as well to break down those barriers.
Exactly.
Yeah. The last question we had, which we didn't get to, but I think actually it's very similar to the response we've had, is about how do we support people to self-advocate. But again, I think that involvement of visibility, the provision of universal services will really support that. Again, these are really good questions, and I thank people for your questions today. We're a little bit behind time. We do need to go for tea and coffee just to facilitate yourselves to get back for the next speaker. But I want to thank everyone for your participation, and particularly the panellists here, and well done. Thank you very much.